Does the fossil record provide evidence of a great deluge?
Okay, let me look for a slide. Evolutionary processes require, by definition, advancement from simple to complex. That's okay. That's good. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
There's no other way, right? Would you agree that evolutionary processes require development from small to large? Would you agree with that? All right, let me elaborate a little bit because you're so quiet. If life is going to, by chance, develop in some slime pond and some chemicals come together, is an elephant going to jump out of the pond, or are you perhaps going to get to an amoeba? Is that small or is it large? It's small. So evolutionary scientists talk about the law of Carroll. Everything has to advance from small to large. You can't start with large because that requires a level of complexity that not even the most ardent faith exponent of evolution will be able to follow, right? So it goes from small to large. The third criterion, if there was no life on this planet and somehow fortuitously it came into existence in one place, then the initial diversity of life must have been very low on this planet, and it must have increased to a larger diversity. Would you agree with that? Has to be. There's no other choice. Those are the three absolutes where there's no leeway this way or the other. What we have? We have irreducible complexity. The biochemical processes to make something a living organism are so complicated that it boggles the mind. You take a biochemistry course and you study them one at a time, the glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the whatever. Every single creation or biochemical process in the body is highly complex. Citric acid cycle, the urea cycle, the this cycle, the that cycle, and every single one of them is required for life. That means the very simplest organism has all those complex cycles in order to qualify for the word life. That means that the human being and the elephant in each cell has exactly those same processes. Now, if they are all present in the human being and the elephant, how did they get there? They're also present in the simplest, if there is such a word, of all organisms. That means everything must have been there from the beginning. The only other alternative is parallel evolution, that it evolved over and over and over and over again. Given the complexity and the genetics involved, forget it. They have to be related to this process called life. So in order to live, there's an irreducible complexity. You cannot get it by increment. You either have it or you don't. So there is no advancement from simple to complex. It doesn't exist. Nowhere in the universe does it exist, or on Earth at least. When it comes to development from small to large, you look at the paleontological record, that's what you were speaking about. What do you find? You find large to small. You look at any creature in the paleontological record, and its a factor X larger than anything related today. Every single creature, dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, like helicopters. Yes. You look at all the lizards. You look at any creature. Now, why would they be so much larger? If the law of Carroll says we start small and go big, the fossil record should have all the smaller ones in the lower levels and the bigger ones later. We have a reverse sequence. Thirdly, we have reverse diversity. Now, evolution teaches that life is fortuitous. It starts somewhere, and then the diversity must become more and more. You don't have that. You have a massive diversity right in the Cambrian explosion. Every phylum is there, with varieties that absolutely boggle the mind. We have a fraction left of what there was. A fraction. Now, I want you to think further along those lines. What's the driving force of evolution according to the scientific world? Natural selection. Natural selection is a useless God. In fact, some of the scientific literature actually refers to natural selection, and some of the old evolutionists almost refer to it, and sometimes literally refer to it, in inverted commas of course, as the God, the driving force of the evolutionary process. Natural selection, by the very nature of the word, is precisely that. Selection. Selection of what? It can only be a selection of something that is there, right? And if you're going to have a survival of the fittest in terms of that selection, then that obviously means that there is a fit and an unfit. Isn't that so? So you have to have two options that are there in order for natural selection to operate. Now, excuse me, where did it come from? Did natural selection create anything? No. It only selects between options that are already there. So it's not a good God. It cannot create ex nihilo. It cannot speak and it stood fast. It can only select between what is already there. Now here's the next problem. Natural selection is supposed to have brought about this massive diversity that we have on our planet by natural selection. But what does the process do? It chooses the fit to the detriment of the non-fit. That's where extinction comes in. So natural selection cannot create anything. It can only choose between options that are already there. And once the selection process is over, you go from a minimum of 2 to what? To 1. How can a process that makes less and less make more and more? So how do you explain the reverse sequence? You cannot. Now they'll show you the paleontological record, and they'll show you all these strange creatures, and they'll put on all that flesh. Based on what?
Imagination.
A pretty good one. Based on bone fragments, right? They'll show you in a book on the Cretaceous or whatever, or on the early Tertiary, they'll show you all these elephants with short trunks, long trunks, medium trunks, whatever. They'll show you that everything goes from small to large. You look at any evolutionary tree in any textbook, what will you find? A progression from small to large. Any evolutionary tree. Take the evolution of the horse. You start with the ones at the bottom, Hyracotherium, and you go on, later called Eohippus, and you go all the way up to Equus. Excuse me, they were all contemporaneous. They all come out of the same fossil record. They come out of the mindset of the scientist. So the fossil record, initially, as a scientist, would have confused me. But when I was an evolutionist, here's the evidence if you don't believe me, that during the past decade, this comes from the journal Nature, the past decade, however, the discovery and development of another fauna of marvelous preserved soft-bodied Cambrian organisms at Shenyang in China has proven that full diversity was reached within the explosion itself. Good grief, they call it the Cambrian explosion. That means every single organism, category of organisms that you can think of was there from the beginning. Is that creation or is that evolution? Surely that's creation. Now, I used to be a gradualist, which is a school of thinking based on Darwinism. The only school that makes any sense whatsoever, gradualism. But I had to change my view, and I had to become a punctuated equilibriumist. Because everything was there at the same time. You've probably seen this in one of my lectures, but this is interesting stuff. Natural selection has another problem. It cannot operate at the level of the genotype, it can only operate at the level of the phenotype. So whatever happens at the level of the genotype has to happen by chance. And whatever happens at the level of the phenotype, well, that can be subject to natural selection. So if we had to simplify that, a book of instructions dealing with how this aeroplane has to be constructed, if this were evolution, that would be the genotype. And that would be the phenotype. Now, I can only determine how this aeroplane flies once it's been built, right? So today we have very elaborate systems of models, etc., making sure the thing flies before we actually put a pilot into it, and then we pay him a fortune and we call him a test pilot because he could just fall, right? So how did this book come about? Who wrote this book? Well, logically speaking, if you want to build this airplane, who wrote the book of instructions on how to build it? A designer, right? But when it comes to evolution, who wrote the book? Chance. Chance wrote the book. It had to be fortuitous reactions that came together. And the probabilities are so mind-boggling that, for all intents and purposes, it's a non-entity. But let's go further. Let's say, for example, the probability of the book of instructions coming about actually took place. And you have the book of instructions. Wow. In other words, by pure chance, all the information about who and what an organism is, and finally you are, came about by evolutionary processes by chance. If I have the book of instructions on how to build the aeroplane, how long do I have to wait before the book finally produces the aeroplane? I think millions of years are not sufficient. Let's say it really happened and I put the book on my shelf. How long do I have to sit and wait for the aeroplane to appear? It's not enough to have the information to get the book to appear. The mechanism to translate the book into the aeroplane also has to appear. And that mechanism is far more complex than we can even imagine. Every student will tell you that in biology it's the transcription process, right? It's opened up the book, and then a photocopy is made, which is called RNA, and that RNA has to be taken outside to a factory which has to exist, the ribosome. It has to attach to the ribosome. There has to be enzyme systems, machinery available to transcribe that into a protein. There must be a machinery available to bend that protein into the shape that you need. That protein must be an enzyme which must catalyze. It's mind-boggling before you finally get something. Is that subject to natural selection? No. You have to wait for the aeroplane to appear to know whether it will fly or not. You really need a lot of faith to believe that natural processes did this. Okay? Any other questions?
So there is evidence in the fossil record, and it takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does in creation.
Absolutely. You have to have faith.
Amen.
When I was an evolutionist, the only reason why I didn't take the step to Christian, I took the step from gradualism to punctuated equilibrium, no problem, because the fossil record demanded it.
Yeah.
There was no intermediary. Everything was there at the same time. This must have been evolution at supersonic speed, like Stephen Jay Gould called it at that stage.
Yes.
So I had to become a gradualist. But why didn't I take the step to creationist? Because I would have to acknowledge God. And that was something which was worse than anything I could handle.
Wow.
Because I had an abhorrence for God. Now, why did I have an abhorrence for God? Because of theology. I abhorred God because of theology. Because I was told that God was a monster. He'd roast you forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever on his whim. And that was a wrong theology. So, yes, there's evidence in the fossil record. The whole fossil record speaks of
Yes.
of creation. Let me just point out if I don't know whether I have it in this one. Let me see. No, not in this one. Do I have it up there? No, I don't have it anywhere in that one. Eh?
Aye.
All right, let me just, one point still. Evolution has to deny a universal flood. It has to. Because if you have an evolutionary process and you're developing up your evolutionary tree, one organism after the other evolves over time. And now finally you have the full diversity of everything on the planet, including man. And now you're going to come with a universal flood and destroy everything that lives on terra firma. That means you've destroyed every life form on the planet that lives on solid land. And today it's all here. What does that mean? It means that your evolutionary process from that point should have started again until you get to the evolution of man. Are you with me? So if I break the process of evolution with a total destruction in a universal flood, then I've broken the continuity of the evolutionary development. I have to start evolution all over again. And that's not tenable. So science denies the universal flood. Period.
But they don't seem to mind meteor-based annihilation.
No, but it's always local.
Oh.
It's always local. And theistic evolutionists will go along with the local flood. Now, Noah, as I always say, must have been a moron to build a boat and take all the animals in the boat to save them from a local flood, if he could have just run to higher ground and had the animals over there anyway, right?
That's right.
He should have been able to move and figure that one out, right?
That's right.
Now, is there a Cretaceous layer which is universal, stretching from continent to continent on the same base rocks, yes or no? Yes.
Yes. Yes.
That one point alone shows that the whole world was underwater at the same time. If the whole world was underwater at the same time, then evolution is impossible. Just at one point. One of my colleagues, I won't mention his name, Francois, you know him very well. He sits in church on a Sunday, and he's an evolutionist. He's the paleontology professor at one of our universities. I studied with him. We were honor students and graduates together. And I said to him, you're sitting in church and you teach paleontology and evolution, and you have a problem with the universal flood. Explain it to me. He says, there was no universal flood. I know. I said, I studied with you. I know what we teach. But I want to know why you're sitting in church. Because Jesus said, and the flood came and took them all away. I actually have him on tape, because I had a little tape recorder in my pocket. I'm sneaky. And his answer was, Jesus was ignorant or lying.
Wow.
Yeah, but he sits in church.
Wow.
So if you can twist your mind around that one, well, then you can be anything. Don't let yourself be duped into thinking there's no evidence for creation. A universal chalk layer means a universal flood. Period. There's no argument about it. There's no way around it. And all of those points that I put on just now, we haven't had time now to talk about radiometric dating and all of these things. They're all based on assumptions. You have to make certain basic assumptions, because no stone that you ever break open has a clock in it. It only has a ratio of parent and daughter elements in it. And whether those parent and daughter elements have always been in that particular ratio, whether it has been a closed system, or whether the clock has ever been set to 0, that's pure conjecture and theory. So nobody can tell you this earth is old or this earth is young based on those criteria alone. But let me wrap up. Natural selection is the very worst driving force you can envision for change and evolution. Number 2, the fossil record speaks of an explosion where every single form of phyla was present right from the beginning. That's totally contrary to evolution. The diversity was enormous in the past, and the size relationships is reversed to what you must expect. And then there is a universal chalk layer saying that the whole world was underwater at exactly the same time. And if those points aren't enough for you to at least investigate the possibility that the Bible is true, then there is nothing anybody, including God, can do for you. Yes, sir.
I did a recent presentation, and some of the colleagues asked me afterwards, yes, but you ignored the challenges presented by the obvious issues raised by the Adventist theistic evolutionists. And I'm thinking, yes. And there was a reason why I avoided it. Because I wish to deal with clean water and not go into the muddy one. But I was wondering how you deal with these. Because people have this feeling that just because they have interpreted things in their own minds in a certain way, that the argument sounds interesting or at least plausible, that it must be legitimate.
Right. I have a question for you. Does the Word of God have to come down to your level of understanding, or do you have to come up to the level of understanding of the Word of God? That's the first point. Now, I have sat in the committees, in the faith and science committees, in all of them. Well, not all of them, but most of them, all the big ones. Including, well, I wasn't in the North American ones, but I was in the GC ones, and I was in my own division ones. So I was here in the States in the GC ones, and I was over there. And you were there? No. You weren't there. And there we had to listen to exactly the things that you are talking about. And I'm so grateful to those people, because as a consequence I worked out entire new lecture series to deal with those issues. They were an inspiration to me. But I must agree that some of the ideas that you come across are so painful.
It is painful, yes.
Yeah.
It's agonizing.
Yes. It's like thank you. I have very close sympathies as far as that is concerned. It's so well put, because just yesterday I had a root canal and I think I'm dying. It is very sad when you see how our scientists will compromise on these issues just for a momentary glory of acceptance with the world. It is so sad to see it.
But they don't realize that the world doesn't care about their perceived prestige and
Exactly.
respect and all that.
The world doesn't care about it.
They're all busy elbowing each other.
Right.
So how are they going to be respectful of someone else?
Well, I've been in science most of my life, and I've learned in the scientific world to wear my armor on my back.
Yes.